Welcome to my community. A very warm welcome to our viewers around the world, those of you who continue to follow us weekly via the World Wide Web. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for joining us. We ended last program with the musical experiences of Kid Fork as he serenaded the people and sent them to bed in the aftermath of Hurricane Janet while they were occupying the school. Michael King picks up the discussion at this point, and he proceeds to detail the athletic abilities of his brothers and other youngsters in the community.
My sisters were taught music, went to classes, several of them, and many of them could play. One was actually being taught by our grandmother to play the organ, and none of the boys could play the piano. Not even Mary had a little lamb. We were outside playing cricket, playing football, and having our own athletics meets, running from our home down to the Lynch's home and back. And then we would, for our high jumping equipment, we would cut the palms from the coconut tree and stick them in the ground, and the thin rods with the belly, that will be the rod for high jumping, and put nails in them. And for football, you know, till we got our first football, we used to get big old socks and stockings and stuff them with cloth and use them. Or my enterprising brother Tony would get up early Saturday morning and go to the butcher Rufus Cox further up in Green Hill and get the intestine or the bladder from the pig or the cow, which one, and then we would put water in them and we would kick them around till they burst. That was our football. Nobody could afford to buy a football. My father feeding 14 children, you think we could afford to buy a football? We learned the skills. By the time we came to Harrison, because we had all the skills in all the sports and in athletics, because we did it at home, on our little homestead and on Buxton pasture. It was amazing that people couldn't understand it, you know, that we made our own sport. And we also played a lot of cricket together in Green Hill. Tony was the organizer of the cricket teams, especially when the guys in the new land became teenagers. We used to do a lot of cricket games in the summer, Green Hill versus Spooner's Hill in the Long Gap. And the cricket, it's a BCL team there called Somerset. A lot of those same boys from the Long Gap, Spooner's Hill area went to Buxton with us. Then you had Upper Green Hill versus Lower Green Hill. We were Lower Green Hill, and the Upper Green Hill were the guys in the new land. And Buxton's little playing field was the venue for many nice cricket games and a lot of the kids, everybody, community gathering. And then also there were games sometimes with Jackson. But the biggest game, Jackson used to play at Arsenal playing field where there was a BCL team called Arsenal. Again, the Buxton boys who came from Jackson were primarily the members of Arsenal. Then you had in the rivalry between Green Hill and Caveville was at Montgomery pasture, where there was a vibrant BCL team in the 50s and early 60s. It was first called Swansea, and then they changed the name to Ceylon. And they had some guys who played in annual BCL games. One called Donville Bailey, who worked for years as a lineman with my brother Horace in Lands and Surveys Department. Good all-around cricketer. But the one who was an excellent bowler and good batsman was Gregory Yearwood, the late Gregory Yearwood. They both died. And then there was also a Keith Barker, too, who was a medium pacer. Keith sold newspapers for many years going down the hill in St. Stephen's Hill. But we used to have some rivalry. Desmond Savory, the Walters boy, Keith Fatty Walters, that had a league contract in England, played for Spartan and then migrated to Toronto. And Ollie went to Combermere, and then he went to England, and I think he's either still in England, he might have moved to Canada. But we had some wonderful rivalries with the two communities, and there were some kids in Spooner's Hill who always wanted to play for us, like Tony Jilks. We used to call him Titmus. He was a fast bowler at Maple and at Spartan, but he migrated to New York and lives in Connecticut now. And the last time, he comes down to watch cricket from time to time, but we were all in Australia one year hanging out, I think in 1997, watching a couple of test matches in Adelaide and Perth, you know. So we kept in touch. He always wanted to play for Green Hill, you know, and he did. He was part of our team. But it was a case where the community was more than just people living and eking out a living, but the children became very good friends. And you found them everywhere you went, in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, and elsewhere, sometimes even in the Caribbean. There were some people, I remember Tony telling me about one of the world boys, Dolphus, who died last year in Trinidad. He was on the boundary feeling for Barbados against Trinidad and Queen's Park Oval, and he heard this voice, Tony! And it was a Green Hill man watching cricket in Trinidad, you know. But the community, as I said, the school was the epicenter of the activities in the community. And it was interesting to note that a lot of the kids of Spooners Hill used to find them, they were in Green Hill playing cricket, riding bikes, doing everything, because it was a vibrant young community. Even Tom Adams, as a young kid, used to come to Green Hill to play cricket with my brothers and the guys from the community as a young kid. And he even started a club at home. The guys pay a penny and so forth for club membership and so forth. You know, it was interesting to listen to the stories. There were guys who used to ride to school as a group. Sir Charles Williams, Carl Williams, told me that he used to ride with my brothers down to Combermere when they lived at Edgell in St. Thomas. And in that group also was the late Rudolph Hinkson, who came from St. Joseph, but he stayed with his cousins in Whitehall, the Fosters, and also the late Dr. Ronald Wilson, whose sister was married to Mr. Terence Franklin, the former superintendent of prisons, who lived, again, when you turn into Whitehall, and the first house on the right, the bungalow there. And they used to all ride their bikes to school. And a bicycle was a status symbol, you know. And there was a time when, as I said, there were many people who went to Combermere School, which was the school of choice for many people in the neighborhood who could afford secondary education. The modern high school helped a lot of people who never would have gone to secondary school. And the late Louis Lynch was able to get scholarships for many brilliant people. One of our close friends who grew up in Mahaica, the latter stages of his high school years, because his sister had got married and he was living with his sister and her husband, who was from Lewis Gap. And that was Dr. Chelston Brathwaite. And you know, you can still see Chelston. Sometimes we had to get off the bus right by Turtle Cot, walk up Little Codrington Hill and walk to Green Hill, because that was the stage and it would save you 5 cents a day. So you would walk, come home from school, there's still the sense of going up to Green Hill by the stage. You get off and you save 5 cents. There was also another stage by us. And some of the Combermere boys would get off the bus and walk from Green Hill to Waterford, because that 5 cents made a lot. You can get, as the Combermereans would say, you could get a loaf of 1 or a loaf of 2 from Daisy or from Miss Seeley at Combermere. If you went to Combermere, you know about a loaf of 1 and a loaf of 2, right? That was the Combermere expression. But basically, people had to cut and contrive, and everybody helped and shared what they had. There's some Combermereans that still remind me of my mother's mangoes. The rainfall, they're sheltering in our house, they're waiting for the bus to come, and my mother would feed them or give them mangoes to take home. Basil Levine talks about that ever since. And I always had to him and tell him, you know, you Combermere boys, you still had to end up marrying a woman from Green Hill, you know, whose brothers run around with us also, the Yearwoods, you know, Frankie and Bunny. We had a lot of cricket together. Late Bunny, unfortunately, Hammy, he died a few years ago. But yes, we had some interesting times, and some boys did very well in school. From going to the Allen School, going to the schools in Bridgetown, Harrison College, Combermere. So we went to Courage and Parry Foundation. But interestingly enough, in the late 50s, a lot of boys from Butson School, some of us went to Harrison College, myself, Glenn Catlin, Mark Motley, we were in the same class. We ended up going to Harrison College the same year. And then they had people like Jerry Pilgrim, Hugh Pilgrim, and his brother Avery, who won a Barbados scholarship in 1968 in classics at the Lodge School. He's a lawyer now, sort of retired in Jacksonville, Florida. We used to call him Half Pint, a name that Addie Ford put on him when he went to Lodge School. Because he was very short when he went to Lodge School at 8 years old, extremely bright. But those guys went to Lodge School, and I recall my godmother, Eileen Robinson Cumberbatch, who was the only primary school teacher I had. Very tough lady. And when I say tough, I mean tough as a teacher. And she told me that every year Mr. A.R.V. Newsom, the headmaster of the Lodge School, we'll call Mr. Arthur to ask him if he had any more bright kids to send up to Lodge School. So Lodge School then became the school of choice for many people, the Pilgrims, the Padmores, and my good friend Charles Holder from that was in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and at BT, Barbados Tourism Investment Inc., right? You know, they were Buxtonians. He came from Bush Hall to Buxton. And I think that Noel Lynch had a brother that went to Buxton, but Noel went to Roebuck, I think. But he told him he missed a good education by not going to Buxton.
And of course, we celebrate the Buxton School with Mr. King, and we are particularly pleased that his memories and experiences of that institution were shared on My Community. I will issue a call for anyone to carry out a thorough research on the school and its contribution to Barbados and the world. Now back to community life.
But the amazing thing about the community was that people were always willing to help each other and to share. It so happened that in some cases there were some families who had more access to land and capital than others. If I back up a bit to say 1930, around that time, the farm plantation, which is next door to the Lodge plantation, and you enter the farm obliquely opposite where Bim Beverages was. And I'll talk about the industrialization of Green Hill later, but the farm plantation sold land all the way from that part of Green Hill down to Whitehall Tenantry Road in Codrington Hill. And there were primarily 1 acre lots. This is on the western side of Green Hill. Whereas on the eastern side of Green Hill, from as far up as, well, let's say Warrens, you know, a lot of that land in Warrens, from the other side of the road where you have the polyclinic, further down, that was Friendship plantation land, all the way down to Mahaika. And then when you got to what is now the Church of the Resurrection, and then you had where Rayside operates, Rayside and Company, there were some land that was owned by a white man called Mr. White, incidentally. And that land was sold around the same time as the farm, and in the 1930s. And the important thing about it is that there were some families who came to Green Hill and played a very important role, and some of them were able to employ people in the community. As I said, you know, if you started by where the Fair Trading Commission is located, that was called Good Hope. That was owned by Mr. Gladstone Hope and his wife, Etta Fort Hope. Those are the parents of Lady Stella St. John, 5 girls and 1 boy, Alan, who's no longer with us. Then you had Mr. Cyril Cox. He was a bit of an entrepreneur. He was a baker, shopkeeper, and he also kept a shop on Codrington Hill at the corner of the entrance to Whitehall Plantation House, obliquely opposite Story Gap. And that's an interesting development in terms of Mr. Cox's role in the community, from not only being a shopkeeper and an entrepreneur, a baker in particular, but he also ran an establishment in the war years where he brought in boxers and wrestlers and stick fighters and provided entertainment to many people. There were some German fellas, I don't know how they ended up in Venezuela, but I suspected, you know, people were fleeing the Nazis and so forth, but some of them came over and fought, and there were some colorful characters too who performed in the boxing ring and in the wrestling ring. And then you had other families, only about 4 other families, because there were 2 acre lots from that strip where Mr. Cox, the Hopes, Cox, the Scott, Mr. Skinner, and then at the corner you then entered down to Malvern Lodge. Now Malvern Lodge was a 23 acre holding owned by Mr. Critchlow, who would have been the grandfather of Michael Ruther, the journalist that you will know from CBC and elsewhere, the late Trevor Ruther, and Shirley Ruther Morris, who lives in Virginia. She was in hotel management and human resources in Barbados and overseas. And then after Mr. Critchlow died, I suspect it was around 1959-60, the Power family, Carl and Michael and the late Tyrone, the late Carl, the late Asquith, the late Tyrone, Michael is still here, and so is Orville. I speak to Orville quite often. They live and they established a dairy farm on the 23-acre lot of small plantation, really, that was Malvern Lodge. The Powers stayed there until about 1967, and then Mr. Keith Rayside started his operation. And all that land was transformed from being a dairy farm to a quarry. And that quarry took in a lot of the land right next to Friendship Gully, all the way up to Mahika. And it transformed, Green Hill became more industrial. There was a lot of dust. I mean, you can clean your most beautiful mahogany furniture, and before you leave the room, it is covered in dust again. And a lot of people became ill with asthma and other things. But that's what happens when you move from a rural to industrial situation. There's a universality about that, you know. So we had to live with that. Then across the street from us, in Greenhill, with further up Greenhill, you had families like the Pilgrims, some exceptionally bright boys and girls. There were 10 Pilgrims, 7 boys and 3 girls. Then some of our closest friends were the Lynches. Dr. Barlow Lynch, who was a urologist who comes here, was at George Washington University for many years as a clinical professor of urology. All of these people were connected to Buxton School because they are Greenhill people. And to this day, we all remain extremely close. Wherever we are in the world, we keep in touch, you know. So, and there were 10 Lynches also. 8 boys and 2 girls.
Families do make communities. Let us backtrack further and consider the physical changes and the industrialization of Greenhill. Approximately when did this start, Mr. King?
Of 1954. On the western side, there was a development, we called it the New Land. There are 4 avenues in Greenhill, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. The 4th is in the cut rock, going just before you get to Mahika, obliquely opposite the Church of the Resurrection. And that land was sold, I think, by a Mr. Toppin. But there was some controversy about it because there was a lady who grew up with my mother in as children, really, and this lady migrated to the States. But she had owned the land. But it was land, I understood it was sold, and she did not know. But there was a lawsuit which she won. It took many years to be settled, and she won. But, and I wouldn't call the name, but her brother was a well-known head teacher at one of the urban elementary schools, much revered as an educator in Barbados. So when the New Land was established in the 1950s, around 1953, 54, people moved from Black Rock, from Deacons Road area, Eagle Hall area. Most of the people moved from St. Andrews, St. Thomas, and a few from St. James. I know one family that actually came from Christchurch. I can still see the whole family now. But it was a close-knit community. And as I said, the school, the children, the boys went to Buxton and the girls went to Grace Hill at the primary school. So it was a case, all of a sudden, we growing up in Greenhill went from having just a few families who lived down the road from us, because there was nothing else but sugar canes from just beyond what is now 1st Avenue, Greenhill, up to obliquely opposite Mahika, where there were about 4 other families. And then from there, all the way to Warren's, was nothing on that side of the street but canes and agricultural products from the farm and the lodge plantation. And then there was a small property called Regan Lodge that was owned by the Gills. There's an industrial site there. In fact, International Harvester operated there for many years in the 60s, the 50s and 60s. And I think that company was disbanded. It was a company from Illinois, and I think it was disbanded and had a different name in about the middle 1980s. But it's interesting enough, I once met the sales director on a trip to Latin America. he knew exactly where I lived in Green Hill. I could not believe it, you know. I think we were somewhere in Colombia or Bolivia or something on assignment. But it was interesting to note that International Harvester was there. It's a property right next door to Price Smart. All that, and Regan Lodge was just a little holding that the Gills had. It was not a plantation. And then, of course, you had Warrens. All of that is Highway 2A. You turn left on Highway 2A, Warrens, and head to St. Peter, all the way down to a mile and a quarter. But that's all you saw with Canes. On the other side of the street, in the middle of nowhere, was a British American tobacco company called the Cigarette Factory for most people. And again, it provided jobs for people in the community and nearby communities. There were people who rode from all over Barbados or took the bus, the Jackson or after seat bus, to work at the cigarette factory, as our people called it. And then there were other people who were able to find work from the community, men and women, who will ride all the way up to Edgell, to the Caribbean Confectionery Company, and that was known as the Sweetie Factory. You know, these very basic names that you all remember. But there were jobs. And then, of course, when the Windrush generation came and the opportunity in the mid-50s came to go to England, a lot of people left. Women went to work with Lyons Tea Factory in London. A lot of people went to study to be nurses. Then there were also a lot of people, guys who joined the London Transport, and then the British Army. The British Army were recruiting around 1961, 62 for about a year. A lot of guys left Harrison College and secondary schools and went because they were able then to go on and become accountants and lawyers and other professionals in the United Kingdom because there just weren't enough jobs for people. Then I think the tobacco factory that was established around 1951-52. Again, it meant, and interestingly enough, it had some connections to the community to the extent that they established a cricket team. And around 1964-65, they entered the BCA competition in the second division. And obviously they didn't have enough workers who played, because it was not a huge factory. But they recruited youngsters from the community in Green Hill and a few from Jackson who played for BAT. And soon after that, I don't think they lasted beyond the late 60s. I left Barbados in 1968 for the first of 4 trips out of Barbados, I guess. And we then saw the emergence in 1968 of Bim Beverages. That was a new beverage company that would have challenged Coca-Cola and the Juicy Factory. Coca-Cola in Robert Street and the Juicy Factory on Bay Street, obliquely opposite the Aquatic Gap. Mr. Sam Ashby had a role in the establishment of Bim Beverages. And I remember the opening ceremony on a Sunday afternoon. I know some of my family members bought shares. I don't know if they ever earned 10 cents in the shares, but it was an investment nonetheless. And to see black entrepreneurs getting engaged in an industrial enterprise in Barbados within 2 years of our independence. So the evolution of the housing and the expansion of housing in Barbados was a major project undertaken by National Housing Corporation when Eden Lodge was built. Eden Lodge was built in the late 60s, mainly little estate type houses and so forth. And then there were some other small cottages built where people were able to do add-ons and have some very comfortable homes in the area Eden Lodge and Lodge Terrace. And on the other side of the street, down the track next to where the British American Tobacco Company was, we now know it as Manor Lodge. That's where you have Friendship Heights. And then Friendship Heights evolved because it was land that obviously came from Friendship Plantation. And that was another part of the National Housing Corporation's project for sustainable housing for people in the region. And a lot of young, recently married people, young professionals, where people were able to get better housing arrangements for themselves. Then, believe it or not, what happened in the area, we found then that Warren's factory closed. I wasn't in Barbados, but I think it was sometime in the late 1960s or early 70s. The house that is now the corporate residence of First Caribbean Bank is a beautiful old plantation house. That was the home where the Goodin family lived. There were 3 Goodin boys, Michael, Peter, and Roger. Roger was my contemporary at Harrison College. The late Roger, he was a very nice guy. Still have memories of Jack Smale encouraging us to take out the boxing gloves and box. And it was the first, second, third, fourth, and last time I ever wore boxing gloves. When Roger hit me on my chin, I saw the whole galaxy. And my jaw hurt for about a week at Harrison College, you know. But that's my memories of Roger, very nice kid, you know. And he did very well in developing the businesses for Cow Williams as one of their managers, and very brilliant at polo. And unfortunately, he died some years ago. But that was a loss to Barbados. Very nice guy. So things changed. Lodge plantation had sold off a lot of the land, hence the birth of Eden Lodge. And then the land stayed there, and some years later in the 90s, or late 90s, the birth of Price Smart. And then a lot of commercial land around there after the highway was built. Now the highway was built around 1986, 87, 88, you know, and it was actually done in 2 phases. Most people don't realize that the first phase was supposed to be from around Wildy to St. Barnabas, and that was the first phase. But then it was expanded, and I knew that the Right Excellent Errol Barrow had a view that we should pay for it ourselves without getting loans. But he and the late Tom Adams were at one on the need for a highway, except that he didn't feel we needed 2 lanes. And then in the end, we still had to go back to 2 lanes. But then a lot of people bought land close to the highway, and that was how things developed. If you have a road that's connecting from the airport to the seaport, that's your telecommunications and communications hub. So the land in that area will be very, very profitable. But by then, a lot of development had taken place in parts of the Lodge Hill, small clusters of development. You had down the hill below that was Rockdando Heights and Rockdando Park. And then you had Claremont and the development in Claremont. So this was all done all during the 60s, 70s, and early 70s, mid 70s, late 70s, and part of the 80s. And then you found Warren's Crescent, Welch's Terrace, all kinds of other developments. And the highway came right through, and Green Hill changed. The whole area change.
And thanks to Michael King, the area prior to the changes has been recorded for posterity. Once again, I think we should issue a call to our people, especially our students, to conduct further research on the area and write our own community's history. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, do take good care of yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors. The series continues next week at the same time.